In 1848, the very first book the Smithsonian Institution ever published wasn't about presidents or wars. It was a survey of earthen mounds in Ohio, hundreds of them, some larger than the pyramids of Giza in footprint, built in shapes so geometrically precise that surveyors measuring them with 1840s equipment initially assumed they must have been built by someone other than the people already living on the continent. That assumption had a name: the mound builder myth. The idea that a separate, vanished, more advanced race, Vikings, Israelites, a lost civilization, anyone but the ancestors of the native nations still living in Ohio at the time, must have built these earthworks, because surely Native Americans couldn't have. It was wrong. The Smithsonian's own government-funded research eventually proved it was wrong, using data collected from more than 2,000 mound excavations across the country. And yet the myth survived in American popular culture for decades after the government's own scientists had already debunked it, while, at the same time, thousands of the mounds those excavations damaged or destroyed were being levelled for farmland, quarried for gravel, or paved over entirely, taking whatever evidence they held with them. This is the story of the Ohio earthworks, one of the largest concentrations of monumental ancient architecture in North America, built by indigenous cultures roughly 2,000 years ago, and a 150-year documented record of how the country that inherited them handled the evidence, what was written down, what was buried twice. And what a UNESCO World Heritage listing in 2023 finally forced back into public conversation. What was actually built start with scale, because most people underestimate it. Between roughly 100 BC and 500 C, indigenous peoples archaeologists now call the Hopewell culture, a term borrowed from a 19th century Ohio landowner whose farm contained one of the sites. Not a name any of the builders used for themselves, constructed an extraordinary network of earthworks across Ohio's river valleys. These weren't simple burial mounds, though burial mounds were part of the tradition. Some of the Hopewell sites were geometric earthworks on a scale that's difficult to convey without numbers, the Newark earthworks in Licking County, Ohio. Once covered more than 4 square miles, the largest set of connected geometric earthworks in the world. The Octagon earthworks within that site align with the rising and setting points of the moon across an 18.6-year lunar cycle, a level of astronomical precision that required generations of sustained observation to achieve. Serpent Mound, in Adams County, is a quarter-mile-long effigy mound in the shape of a coiled serpent, one of the largest surviving effigy mounds on Earth. In July 2023, UNESCO inscribed 8 of these Hopewell earthwork sites grouped together as the Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks as a World Heritage Site, placing them in the same designation category as the pyramids of Giza and Stonehenge. That inscription is real, current, and documented. It's also, for most Americans, the first time they've heard these sites mentioned at all, which is itself worth sitting with, because the sites weren't newly discovered. They've been sitting in Ohio the entire time. So here's the first real question this episode has to answer. If these earthworks are genuinely comparable in scale and sophistication to some of the most famous ancient monuments on Earth, why do so few Americans know they exist? Part of the answer starts with what happened the moment 19th century settlers and surveyors first encountered them, and what they decided to believe instead of the truth sitting in front of them. The people who built these earthworks left behind enough evidence copper ornaments, sourced from as far as Lake Superior, obsidian from Yellowstone, shark teeth from the Gulf Coast, all found inside Ohio mounds to prove a trade network spanning half the continent. 19th century Americans looked at that same evidence and decided it proved something almost exactly backwards. The myth the government had to disprove by the mid-1800s, a specific belief had taken hold across American popular science and press coverage that Native Americans, as they existed at the time of European contact, could not possibly be the descendants of whoever built these earthworks. The prevailing theories credited a lost race, sometimes described as an ancient civilization that had been wiped out or driven off by ancestors of the very native nations who lived across that same land in the 1800s. This wasn't a harmless folk theory. It served a specific political function during a period when the US government was actively engaged in forced removal of native peoples from Ohio and the broader Midwest. If the monumental architecture scattered across the region had been built by some vanished advanced people rather than by the ancestors of the Shawnee, Miami, Wyandot, and other nations being displaced, it became easier to frame that displacement as simply making room for settlement on land that had no meaningful prior claim by its current inhabitants, rather than as the removal of a people from monuments their own ancestors had built. The Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology, under its first director John Wesley Powell, commissioned archaeologist Cyrus Thomas in the 1880s to conduct a systematic, nationwide investigation into exactly this question. Thomas's team excavated and documented mounds by the thousands. Ohio was one of the most heavily surveyed states, compiling evidence in a process that took the better part of a decade. His final report, published by the Bureau of Ethnology in 1894, reached an unambiguous, government-published conclusion: the mounds were built by the ancestors of the native peoples living in the Americas, not by any separate vanished civilization. The mound builder myth was, as far as the federal government's own commissioned science was concerned, officially settled. And yet the myth didn't disappear from popular culture for decades afterward. It persisted in newspapers, popular books, and local legend well into the 20th century, long after the institution that had funded the research meant to answer the question had already published its answer. So the myth was debunked by 1894. The mounds kept getting destroyed anyway, not by mystery, but by something far more ordinary: agriculture, urban expansion, and a 19th century excavation process that, even when well-intentioned, wasn't built to preserve what it found. What the digging itself cost here's, where suppressed becomes the wrong word for part of this story, and lost through negligence becomes the more accurate one, which, historically, is arguably worse. Because it means nobody was even trying to hide anything. Nobody had to. Ohio, at the peak of mound-building activity, is estimated by archaeologists to have contained many thousands of earthen mounds and enclosures. The overwhelming majority no longer exist in any recoverable form. Some were levelled by 19th and early 20th century farmers who needed the land ploughed flat and had no legal or cultural obligation to preserve what stood on their own property. Some were quarried for their earthen fill, used as convenient sources of dirt and gravel for road construction. Others were built over entirely as Ohio cities expanded, including, notoriously, sections of the Newark earthworks themselves, parts of which have sat for more than a century under a private golf course, a use that has been the subject of an extended and only recently resolved legal and cultural dispute over public access to a site now recognized by UNESCO as a World Heritage location. Even the mounds that were excavated rather than simply destroyed present a documentation problem. 19th century archaeological method, including much of the Smithsonian-funded mound survey work itself, predates modern standards for stratigraphic recording, artifact cataloguing and preservation. Excavators of the era were often working quickly across huge numbers of sites, without the systematic labelling and long-term storage protocols that professional archaeology takes for granted today. Artifacts collected from thousands of individual mound excavations were distributed to museums, private collectors, and institutions across the country, and in many documented cases, the paper trail connecting a specific artifact back to the specific mound, layer. And context it came from was incomplete, inconsistent, or lost entirely over the following century. This mattered enormously once the United States passed the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act in 1990, a federal law requiring museums and federal agencies to inventory Native American human remains and cultural items in their holdings and work toward returning them to affiliated tribes. The NAGPRA inventory process, which is still ongoing more than 3 decades later, forced a genuine reckoning. Institutions across the country discovered they were holding the remains of thousands of individuals, many originally excavated from Ohio and other mound sites, with documentation so poor that determining even basic facts, which mound, which excavation, sometimes which state, proved difficult or impossible in a meaningful number of cases. That's the real documented version of what happened to everything they found. Not a single dramatic cover-up. A century-long accumulation of incomplete records, institutional turnover, and 19th century archaeological practice followed by a federal law that only in the last few decades forced institutions to actually count what they'd been holding and confront how much of it they could no longer properly account for. The 2023 UNESCO listing didn't happen in a vacuum. It came after decades of quieter work by archaeologists, tribal historic preservation offices, and advocacy groups pushing to get these sites and the story behind them back into public view. What that recognition still hasn't fully resolved is the question of public access to the sites still sitting under private land. The Octagon earthworks, part of the larger Newark earthworks complex and one of the 8 sites in the 2023 UNESCO inscription, sat for more than a century inside the grounds of a private country club, Mound-Builders Country Club, which had operated a golf course over and around the ancient earthwork since the early 1900s under a long-term lease arrangement with the Ohio History Connection, the state historical society that holds legal title to the land. For most of that period, public access to the Octagon earthworks, the same site whose lunar alignments represent one of the most sophisticated astronomical achievements of ancient North America, was limited to a handful of open days per year, when the golf course would close so the public could walk the grounds. The Ohio History Connection, along with Native American advocacy groups, spent years pursuing legal action to reclaim full public access to the site, arguing that an UNESCO-eligible ancient monument of major cultural and scientific significance shouldn't remain functionally inaccessible behind a private golf club's operating schedule. That legal dispute worked its way through Ohio courts over multiple years, centered on eminent domain proceedings and the compensation owed to the country club for the remaining years of its lease. It was resolved only recently, clearing the way for the site's operation as a fully public historical and cultural landmark rather than a golf course with occasional public access days, a resolution that arrived not long before and directly informed the site's UNESCO inscription. It's worth being precise about what this dispute was and wasn't. It wasn't a secret conspiracy to hide the earthworks from the public. The golf course's presence was well known locally for generations, and the legal fight over access was conducted in open court and covered by regional press. But it is a genuinely documented example of how a monument now recognized as globally significant spent the majority of the 20th century functionally sidelined from public life, not because anyone was actively suppressing knowledge of it, but because of an ordinary, decades-old land use arrangement that nobody with sufficient legal standing challenged until relatively recently. The Octagon's access dispute is resolved now, but it raises a harder question the UNESCO listing alone can't answer. How many other Hopewell-era sites, smaller and less legally contested, are still sitting on private land across Ohio today, unexcavated, unprotected, and functionally invisible to the public record, the same way the Octagon was for the past 100 years? What's still missing from the record modern archaeologists working on Hopewell-era sites today operate under a completely different standard than their 19th century predecessors: closer collaboration with tribal nations, better preservation science, and legal frameworks like NAGPRA that didn't exist when the original mound survey excavations took place. That's a genuine, documented improvement. But it doesn't undo what was already lost. The honest scholarly position on Ohio's mound-building cultures today involves an unusual mix of remarkable confidence and real, acknowledged uncertainty. Researchers can say with confidence that the Hopewell earthworks represent a level of astronomical, engineering, and social organization that took generations to develop and required coordination across a trade network spanning much of the continent. What they can't always say with confidence is exactly what many specific mounds contained, because the excavation and documentation of a significant number of them happened under standards, or with a complete absence of standards that make full reconstruction of the original context impossible now. That gap between what clearly existed and what can now be definitively reconstructed isn't a mystery being hidden from you. It's a measurable, documented consequence of 150 years of land use decisions, archaeological practice that predates modern preservation science, and a federal reckoning through NAGPRA that only began in 1990, more than a century after the most destructive period of unrecorded mound levelling had already taken place. The 2023 UNESCO designation is, in a real sense, the first major moment in over a century where this story has had a chance to reach a wide audience on its own terms, not filtered through the lost race mythology of the 1800s, and not buried under the same obscurity that let a golf course sit on a lunar observatory for 100 years without most of the country noticing. What makes the story of Ohio's earthworks different from a straightforward cover-up is that almost nobody involved was trying to hide anything for most of that century and a half. The land was farmed because farming was what the land was for. The golf course operated because a lease said it could. The federal government funded research that correctly debunked a racist myth about who built these monuments, and then that correct answer still took another 100 years to meaningfully reach the public, because correcting an official record and changing what the public actually knows turned out to be two very different processes. That gap between what the evidence has said for over a century and what most people have actually heard is the real subject of this episode. The Smithsonian's own 1894 report settled the question of who built these earthworks. It just took until 2023 and a UNESCO plaque for that answer to travel as far as the myth it corrected. If you want to see the primary sources yourself, the 1848 Squire and Davis survey, Cyrus Thomas's 1894 Bureau of Ethnology report, and the UNESCO nomination documents for the Hopewell ceremonial earthworks, I've linked what's publicly available in the description. This is a documented story sitting in plain sight, in the middle of Ohio, for anyone who goes looking.